The bullet trace was a silver streak cutting through the heavy, shimmering air. It looked perfect. The trajectory was flat, the velocity was high, and the math on the ballistic computer said it was a guaranteed hit. Sergeant Davis, the unit's top marksman, watched through his $3,000 scope, waiting for the pink mist or the metallic clang of steel at 1,200 yards. He had dialed the windage perfectly. The electronic flags spaced every 100 yards were all snapping sharply to the right. A full-value wind. He had held 3 mils left, exactly what the computer demanded. But the bullet didn't hit the target. It didn't even hit the dirt near the target. It impacted 4 feet to the right, kicking up a lonely puff of dust that was immediately swallowed by the heat waves. A clean miss. A catastrophic miss. In the silence that followed, broken only by the crack of the supersonic shockwave arriving late, Davis stared at his scope in disbelief. His spotter was frantically tapping the weather meter. The wind flags were still pointing right. The computer was still saying hold left. The technology said he should have hit, but reality said he had failed. Then, from the shooting mat to his left, came the sound of a bolt closing. It was a heavy metallic clunk, like a bank vault shutting. No beeps, no electronic voices, just steel on steel. The old man lying there, the one wearing a floppy boonie hat and a shooting jacket that looked older than the War on Terror, didn't check a wind meter. He didn't look at the flags. He was looking at something else, something invisible to the uninitiated. He exhaled, a long, slow breath that seemed to empty his lungs completely. He squeezed the trigger. Crack. 1.5 seconds later, clang. The steel target at 1,200 yards swung violently, a center punch. The old man cycled his bolt, the brass casing flying through the air and catching the sunlight before landing in the dust. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He just dialed his scope down and whispered one sentence that would haunt Sergeant Davis for the rest of his career. The flags are lying, son. Look at the water. If you think technology can replace instinct in the field, type focus in the comments right now. Stay with this story, because you're about to learn the lost art of reading the air itself, a technique that saves lives when the batteries die and the wind starts playing games. 3 hours earlier, the range at Fort Benning was already baking under a humid Georgia sun. It was the annual International Sniper Competition, a gathering of the deadliest long-range shooters from across the military and law enforcement spectrum. The air was thick enough to chew on. The humidity was 90%, turning the range into a sauna. Among the competitors were the best of the new breed, young, fit, and equipped with ballistics calculators that could account for the rotation of the Earth, the temperature of the powder, and the humidity of the air. They were technicians of death, and leading the pack was Sergeant Davis. Davis was 24, a prodigy with a rifle. He trusted his data. He worshipped his Kestrel wind meter. To him, shooting was a math problem. If you solved the equation, the bullet went where it was supposed to go, and then there was Master Sergeant Miller. They called him Gunny, though he had retired 5 years ago. He was invited back every year as a legacy competitor, a nod to the old guard. Miller didn't look like a sniper. He looked like a grandfather who had gotten lost on the way to a fishing trip. He carried a bolt-action rifle with a wood stock that had been bedded and rebedded so many times it was more epoxy than timber. His scope was a fixed 10 power. Battered and scratched on the outside, he didn't carry a ballistic computer. He carried a small spiral-bound notebook and a mechanical pencil. During the prep time, Davis had walked past Miller's mat. The young sergeant was setting up his wind flags, high-tech streamers on poles that he placed at strategic intervals down the range. He checked his anemometer. He synced his scope to his wrist computer. He looked over at Miller, who was simply staring downrange through a spotting scope, adjusting the focus ring back and forth, back and forth. No flags, no meter, just staring. "You forget your kit, Gunny?" Davis asked, not unkindly, but with that edge of pity young men often have for the old. "The wind is picking up. It is going to be a switchy one today. You need the data." Miller didn't take his eye off the spotting scope. He was watching the air shimmer above the grass at the 600-yard line. He was watching the way the heat waves, the Mirage, boiled and flowed. "I have got all the data I need," Miller mumbled. Davis chuckled and shook his head. "Visual estimation is a degradable skill, Gunny. That is what the manual says. The Kestrel doesn't guess. It measures. You trust your eyes, you miss. You trust the sensor, you hit. It is simple physics." Miller finally pulled back from the scope. He looked at Davis with eyes that were a pale, washed-out blue like denim left in the sun too long. "Physics is fine, Sergeant, but the wind does not read manuals, and flags only tell you what the wind is doing where the flag is. They do not tell you what it is doing 10 feet above the flag where your bullet is." Davis dismissed the comment. He went back to his calculations. He was confident. He had the best gear. He had the best training. He had the math. The competition began. For the first few stages, the targets were inside 800 yards. The wind was consistent. Davis dominated. His computer gave him the holds, and he drilled the targets. Miller was slower. He took his time, calculating in his head, referencing his notebook. He hit his targets, but he wasn't fast. Davis felt a surge of superiority. The old ways were dying for a reason. Speed and tech were the future. Then came the Widowmaker, the final stage, 1,200 yards, across a valley. The terrain was tricky. There were berms, a creek bed, and a dense tree line on the left side. The sun was at its peak, and the heat mirage was terrible. The target looked like it was dancing underwater, blobbing and shifting in the optical distortion, but the real enemy was the wind. At the firing line, the wind was blowing left to right at 5 miles an hour. At the target, the flags showed a wind blowing left to right at 10 miles an hour. It looked like a simple full-value wind call. Hold left. Let the wind drift the bullet right into the center. Davis lay down. He went through his checklist. Parallax adjusted. Cant level checked. He took a reading with his wind meter. It confirmed the flags. He punched the data into his computer. The solution came back. Hold 3.2 mils left. It was an aggressive hold, but the data was solid. He dialed the turret. He settled in behind the rifle. He breathed. He fired, and he missed. Wide right. The bullet had drifted almost twice as much as the computer predicted. Davis was stunned. He cycled the bolt. Maybe it was a bad round. Maybe he jerked the trigger. He fired again. Same hold, same result. A puff of dust far to the right. He was chasing the wind, and he was losing. The range officer called out, "Miss!" 2 rounds remaining. Davis was sweating now. The math was broken. He looked at the flags. They were screaming left to right. Why was the bullet drifting so far? He panicked. He doubled his hold. He guessed. He fired. Miss. Left this time. He had overcompensated. He was flailing. Then it was Miller's turn. The old master sergeant lay down on the hot concrete. He didn't touch his elevation turret. He didn't look at the flags that Davis had planted so carefully. He reached forward and tweaked the focus on his scope. He wasn't focusing on the target. He was focusing on the air about 2/3 of the way down the range. He was looking at the boil. In the optics of a high-powered scope, heat waves are visible. They look like running water. If the heat waves go straight up, there is no wind. If they tip over, there is wind. The more they tip, the faster the wind. If they flatten out, the wind is howling. But Miller saw something else. He saw the layering. Down near the ground, where the flags were, the heat waves were tipping left to right. That was the ground wind. But Miller focused higher, up where the bullet would actually be travelling at the apex of its arc. Up there, the Mirage was doing something different. The heat waves were flowing violently from right to left, a cross-current, a hidden river of air flowing in the opposite direction of the ground wind, channeled by the valley's shape. The flags were telling the truth about the ground, but they were lying about the air. Miller adjusted his position. He didn't dial the windage. He held Kentucky windage in the reticle. He ignored the flags that said hold left. He aimed slightly to the right of the target. To Davis, watching through his spotting scope, it looked like insanity. The old man was aiming into the wind. He was aiming exactly where the wind should have pushed the bullet off the planet. Miller's breathing slowed. He waited. He watched the shimmer in the air. He waited for a let-up, a momentary pause in the turbulence. He saw the Mirage slow down for a fraction of a second. Crack! The heavy recoil of the .300 Winchester Magnum pushed Miller back. He stayed on the gun. He watched the trace. The bullet rose, climbing into the valley air. The ground wind pushed it right, but then, as it reached its peak, the hidden upper current caught it. It pushed the bullet back to the left, fighting the ground wind. The two forces cancelled each other out. The bullet dropped like a stone, straight and true, clang, target hit. Davis's jaw dropped. He looked at his computer. It was impossible. Miller cycled the bolt. He did it again. He read the shimmer, saw the change, adjusted his hold by a hair. Crack. Clang. Target hit. 4 shots. 4 hits. The old man stood up, brushing the dust off his elbows. He picked up his brass. A heavy silence hung over the firing line. The range officer, a colonel who had seen combat in 3 decades, walked over. He had been watching through a high-powered spotting scope. He looked at Davis, who was staring at his expensive equipment as if it had betrayed him. Then he looked at Miller. "Good shooting, Gunny," the colonel said. Miller nodded. "Tricky air out there, Colonel. Valley funnels the upper draft back against the prevailing. Flags don't catch it because they are too low." The colonel turned to Davis. "Sergeant, do you know why you missed?" Davis shook his head, looking defeated. "The computer. The data said hold left. The flags were blowing right. It doesn't make sense, sir. The physics don't work." "The physics work fine, Sergeant," the colonel said, his voice hard. "You just measured the wrong variables. You were looking at the tools. Gunny Miller was looking at the reality." Miller walked over to the young sergeant. He didn't lecture him. He didn't mock him. He pointed his finger toward the shimmering heat waves dancing over the valley floor. "Son," Miller said, his voice kind but firm, "those electronic flags are for amateurs. They tell you what the wind did 3 seconds ago, 10 feet off the ground. But the Mirage? The Mirage tells you what the air is doing right now, right where your bullet lives. It's the breath of the world. You have to learn to see it." Davis looked at the shimmering air. For the first time, he didn't just see distortion. He tried to see the flow. He tried to see the river in the sky. "But Gunny," Davis asked, "how did you know the upper wind was stronger than the ground wind?" Miller tapped his temple. "Because the Mirage was flat up top but rolling on the bottom. Flat means fast. Rolling means slow. Your computer can't see that. Only you can. You stopped being a shooter and started being a data entry clerk. A sniper reads the world, not the screen." Davis stood there for a long moment. He looked at his Kestrel. He looked at his wrist computer. Then he took them off and shoved them deep into his rucksack. He picked up his spotting scope. "Show me," Davis said. "Show me how to read the boil." Miller smiled. It was the first time he had smiled all day. It was a genuine, crinkly smile that lit up his weathered face. He sat back down on the shooting mat and patted the space beside him. "Sit down, Sergeant. First thing you need to know, water never lies." For the next hour, while the other competitors packed up their high-tech gear, the old master and the young prodigy sat in the dust. Miller taught him the language of the wind. He taught him that a boil straight up meant 0 wind. He taught him that a 30-degree tip meant a 3 to 5 mile per hour wind. He taught him that when the lines flatten out and race, you hold for a hurricane. He taught him to ignore the flags, ignore the grass, and trust the optical distortion of the light itself. Davis didn't win the competition that year, but he never missed a wind call like that again. He learned that technology is a tool, but the mind is the weapon. He learned that in the high-stakes world of long-range precision, the most expensive gear in the world is worthless if you don't have the eyes to see the truth. As you watch this, think about your own life. How often do you rely on the flags, the data, the news, the opinions of others, to tell you which way the wind is blowing? And how often do you stop, look at the Mirage, and read the situation for yourself? We live in a world of noise, a world of flashing indicators and digital readouts, but sometimes the truth is hiding in the subtle shimmer that everyone else ignores. Gunny Miller didn't need a battery to tell him where to aim. He needed focus, he needed experience, and he needed the humility to look past the obvious. If this story reminded you that wisdom beats widgets, hit that like button. It helps us keep these stories alive. And if you want to hear about the time a janitor silenced a boardroom with a pencil, a story of quiet genius you won't believe, make sure you are subscribed. You do not want to miss that one. Leave a comment below with the word focus if you believe we need to trust our instincts more than our screens. I will be down there reading your comments. Until next time, watch your wind and keep your powder dry.